Hi VIPs, John's question is about FX or full frame sensors versus DX or cropped frame sensors. He's asking about the differences, but not in overly technical terms, just enough to understand how the different sizes affect magnification and picture taking overall. There are a lot of different sensor sizes out there, but we'll focus on two today. Full frame, which is a sensor roughly the same size as 35mm film, and crop sensors are smaller, or rather a subset of the full frame size. I've made these ridiculously large samples here so that you can see the relative difference. One term that you'll hear a lot is crop factor. When you take a picture with this full frame sensor at the same distance as with this cropped sensor using the same lens, the cropped sensor image will appear to be zoomed, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Let's talk about lens selection first. On full frame, a 50mm lens acts very much like your eyes. Put a 50mm lens on your FX camera and look through the viewfinder. Everything looks about the same size as it does when you pull the camera away. Some people call this a normal lens because the perspective is pretty normal. Now take the edges of the sensor away on your cropped sensor camera, and now when you print the same photo again at the same size, 4x6 or 8x10, everything looks bigger, as though you zoomed in with that lens that doesn't actually zoom. But then the deal is that a lot of you want a normal lens for that crop sensor camera, so you can go with a wider focal length to get the same effect. This 35mm f2 lens is approaching wide angle on a full frame camera, but on a cropped sensor camera, it provides a normal perspective. Why this 35mm f2 full frame lens? Well, that brings me to another issue involving that crop factor I talked about a minute ago. So I have this 35mm f2 lens, but I also have this 35mm f1.8 DX lens. This lens is optimized for cropped sensor cameras, which means that it can utilize the camera's full sensor on a cropped sensor camera. But on a full frame camera, it will only utilize a portion of the sensor. Quick side note, you cannot always use a lens which is optimized for cropped sensor cameras on your full frame camera. With Nikon cameras, you can. With Canon cameras, you cannot. So whatever you shoot, make sure you check with your camera's brand to make sure that your camera and lens are compatible. So the older FX lens is designed to fill the full frame. When I use it on a full frame camera, it's a moderate wide angle, and on a cropped camera, it's a normal perspective. Depending on the brand of camera that you shoot, the crop factor is roughly 1.5x. So to figure out what the 35mm lens is going to act like on a cropped camera, you multiply 35 times 1.5 to get 52.5. Or let's take the 50mm. It's a normal perspective on full frame, but when you put it on DX, it will act more like 75mm would on full frame. It's not all about cropping though. Just talking about one single prime lens, it has a certain depth of field at a certain aperture and specific distance from the subject. With crop sensors, you tend to move back to get everything in the frame. When you move back, depth of field increases, meaning that more is in focus. This causes some folks to say that it is more difficult to get creative depth of field effects with crop sensor cameras. I treat the difference as just another adjustment to make for the gear that you are using. People will tell you that sensor size alone affects depth of field. That's not strictly true. It's the changing distance that you shoot from your subject with the smaller sensor that affects depth of field. So indirectly, yes, it does, because you tend to shoot from a different distance with a different sensor size. Depth of field is then changing. One other difference that makes full frame very popular is better low light performance. Here's the deal. Current generation full frame and crop sensor cameras do great in low light. In-camera processing gets better each year, but also full frame sensors tend to have larger pixels, meaning each can get more light and produce an overall clearer image in low light situations. Frankly, I'm quite pleased with low light performance both in cropped and in full frame. I'm never scared of a little noise, as I'm someone who's still shooting with film sometimes, and I think a little grain can help set the mood of an image. Which do I prefer? Honestly, I shoot them interchangeably. I love my FX D800 for the image clarity and features that it brings, and I love my DX D300S for its speed and responsiveness. The manufacturers have sold a lot of crop sensor cameras in the last 10 years, and right now there's a big push towards full frame because camera manufacturers sell cameras, and full frame bodies, they're more expensive than cropped sensor bodies. Of course, there's plenty of competition between brands to produce the best cameras on the market, and we, the consumer, definitely benefit from the progress. Thanks, John, for the question. Sensor size is such a hot topic, and it can definitely be a little bit confusing. And thanks to the rest of you VIPs out there for your support.